Greetings class. Today I want to talk to you about 3 more articles on the topic of Anglo-Indian warfare in colonial America. These 3 are all from the Project Muse database. So the first article is by William Starna and Jose Brandao. It's titled From the Mohawk-Mahican War to the Beaver Wars, Questioning the Pattern. This is an interesting article. This article, Starna and Brandao are arguing against a long-standing historiography. And so these wars, called the Beaver Wars, that's a name that white people attributed to these wars. And they called them the Beaver Wars because for a long time historians thought that these wars were fought over beavers. Beaver fur, the rights to trap fur, the territory that held the beavers to get the fur. And so for a long time, all of the arguments about the Beaver Wars were economic. And Starna and Brandao say, well, actually, that's not true. This is not a war based in economics. It's based in culture. Okay, and so they're discussing something that we call the Morning War cycle. And it's an Eastern Woodland Indian cultural phenomenon where these Indians are going to war to replace dead members of their own community. And as they go to war, there's 2 ways they can replace these members. They can take captives and then adopt them back into their community as living people. So they capture a person and they bring them back, and then they go through a process, and now that person is part of the tribe that captured them. The other process is they go out, they capture somebody, same way, they bring them back, but this time it goes through a ritualistic torture, and they actually torture the person to death, and that person dies as well, but it's still seen to spiritually replace the person that they lost. And so these Indian wars really pick up after contact, because killing has to lead to more killing because you have to replace who you lost. And so they say these wars are about culture. It's about this morning war cycle. It's not about economics. It's not about getting beaver furs. It's not about getting furs to trade for guns. It's about the culture of these Eastern Woodland Indians and how the culture intertwines with their need to go to war. So this is a cultural methodology, and it is challenging long-standing historiography that the Beaver Wars were about trapping beavers, getting furs, and trying to get access to guns. Their sources are mostly either Dutch or French records. They're studying basically New York and Quebec, so or New Netherlands, but we call it New York. So they're studying Dutch and French records, also anthropological and archaeological records. All right, next article is by Lars C. Adams. It's called The Battle of Wyandotte Creek, a story of the Anglo-Powhatan War in early Carolina. Okay, so this is an interesting article because it's about the Anglo-Powhatan Wars, all right, which would be the 3 wars between the English settlers at Jamestown and the Powhatan Confederacy or Powhatan Chiefdom in Virginia. But this one actually takes place in North Carolina, this skirmish. It's actually a couple of raids. And so for a long time, the historiography had looked at this conflict or these 2 raids and assumed it was just something separate. It wasn't part of the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. And Adams says, no, this actually was part of the Third Anglo-Powhatan War. It's a military methodology, and it's based on new evidence. So his source is he finds these records where in 1708, Virginia had sent some men out to question older people that were still living from the time of the Anglo-Powhatan Wars and things like that, and to ask them, hey, where exactly is the border between Virginia and North Carolina? And they end up finding this guy named Henry Plumpton, who's 86 years old at the time, and he tells them this story of when he went on this raid into what would become North Carolina as part of this Third Anglo-Powhatan War. So very interesting, based on this discovered record of the Virginia government questioning this old man. The third article I want to talk about is by Elizabeth Hornor. It's titled Intimate Enemies, Captivity and Colonial Fear of Indians in Mid-18th Century Wars. So this is basically looking at the mid-1700s as opposed to the 1600s. But it ties in because of her thesis. So what she looks at is Pontiac's War. If you're not familiar with Pontiac's War, this was a war that happened right after the French and Indian War, and it was when the English colonists started expanding into the territory like Ohio, Indiana, that area. And the Indians got mad and they started fighting, and to appease them, Britain created the Proclamation Line of 1763. Said, hey, white people stay on this side, Indians stay on this side. And what she says is, most of the time in history, we look at the Proclamation Line of 1763, Pontiac's War, and the Proclamation Line that comes out of it as the beginning of part of the American Revolution. So this is sort of one of the first things that turns the settlers against the English government. And so she says it's always been looked at as the beginning of something, which would be the American Revolution. She says, no, we need to turn around and look at it as the end of something. Because what she says is, since 1607, since Jamestown, the whites and the Indians, as the frontier moves, there has been a overlapping presence. So, of course, the whites on the coast, the Indians in the west, but as the frontier moves, there's a gray area where it's both white and Indian. And so she says this is where the most understanding between the two cultures and the most working together and understanding each other is taking place. And she says a large part of that is through captivity. As I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Starna and Brandao's article, the Indians, a large goal of their warfare was to capture people, capture them alive, not kill them. They might kill them later as a ritual, but the primary goal is to capture people and bring them back. And so what happens is you have lots of examples of white people being captured by Indians and living with them. And of course, in some cases, they become part of that tribe as part of that adoption process. And so that's our best example of how these two cultures actually get to see each other. Because if you're being raided, that's one, your perception of Indians is that they're warriors, that they come in a raid, they're attackers, savages, whatever. But as people go and are captured, and you know, obviously that's not something they want, but as they're captured and they start to experience the day-to-day life of these Indians, they actually have the first-hand account of how these Indians actually live. And so what she says is this Proclamation Line is the end of that period, because from this point on, there's a separation. It is the from now on, there is no overlapping frontier. There's a hard line, and you're on this side and they're on this side. And of course, a few years later, the English are defeated, America wins its independence, so on and so forth. But there's never again that large-scale overlapping area. It becomes, okay, what do we do with the Indians? Do we push them west? Do we assimilate them? So on and so forth. So she says we need to turn around and look at the Proclamation Line as sort of an end point and what was leading up to it, rather than a starting point and what happens afterwards. Thank you very much.